Today's speaker is my friend, Donnie Joyner. And I think all the things that Donnie Joyner does, and anybody here who does not know Donnie, it's incredible. Everybody.
Not know Donnie.
So Donnie's a leader of the community. He's a definite organizer. Yeah, definitely organizer. Well, he organizes anything that happens after noon.
Correct.
Not so good before then.
No.
He's a volunteer. As an example, he's currently the vice president of the Southport Historical Society. I believe you're the founder of the Black History Symposium.
Yes.
Yeah, the new one.
So that's what was the 10th anniversary of the.
No, this will be, I think, 13th.
13th. Okay.
Ooh.
And when Donnie does it, it stays. When he's a historian, and that's a good thing that he is a historian because he's today's speaker. And he talk about the history of the NAACP. I'm sorry, but I always start that, and what crosses my mind is NCAA.
That's all right.
Drives me nuts.
It's quite all right.
In Southport and Brunswick County. So, welcome, Donnie Joyner.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning to everybody. He's already told you who I am. Normally, he's right. I don't usually get up this early in the morning. My hair doesn't get up until about 1. I get up at about 11:30 or 12. But today, we're going to be talking about the history of the NAACP in Southport. But now, before we get into the history, you always have to have how things started. So, this slide, people say, why is that slide down there, the sign of the Declaration of Independence? What's that got to do with the Southport NAACP? Well, before we get to Southport NAACP, we got to figure out who was and what is the NAACP. We hold these truths. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Yes, I had to memorize this as a kid in school. But this is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I thought that would be a good slide. This is the reason for the NAACP. And the next slide, I'm going to go through this quickly because this is not about Southport. Springfield, Illinois, 1908. How many people know what happened in Springfield, Illinois in 1908? Raise your hands. Okay, we got two. What happened?
There was a massacre, essentially.
Yes, it was.
What?
It was a massacre. It was a massacre in Springfield, Illinois. Now, like any other thing, like today, like the high school shootings and all that, there's always something that happens afterward. So, remember, 1908. 1909, I think it was on Lincoln's birthday, or one of them, the NAACP was formed. Now, as you can see there are, let me see if I'm counting them right because I'm half asleep, 2, 4, 6, 8. There are 8 people. These 8 were the original founders of the NAACP. On that picture, starting from your left, going right, is Mary White Overton. She was an American. They call her a socialist, a suffragette, and a journalist. And she was one of the co-founders. Next to her was John Haynes Home. He was a minister. He was a pacifist, and he was also one of the co-founders. Next to him was Moorfield Story. He was an American lawyer. Now, I won't tell you when they're all born, but if you need that, I have it up here. Okay. Then there was Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, she's got a prominent picture up there. I like her picture there. She was an American investigative journalist and educator. And after Ida came Henry, I think it's Mosawick. He was a civil rights advocate, and also one of the co-founders of the NAACP. After Henry, there was Oswald Garrison Viller. He was also an American journalist. Now, you got one thing about all these people that have in common. They were all educated. They were all highly intelligent. And after that riot at Springfield, they felt it was time to do something about this. In other words, whenever people look at the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths as self-evidence that all men are created equal. They determined that what happened in Illinois, that wasn't happening. Then you have William Walling, was a American labor reformer and a socialist Republican, born in a wealthy family in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, y'all keeping up with the ones I'm calling out because I probably won't go back over them. Okay. After William, there was William Edward, I think that is Burhart, and Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, when you hear that name, that's what it stands for. And he was considered an American socialist and a historian and a Pan-American civil rights activist. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, they're on two sides of the coin. E.B. Du Bois was well educated. In fact, he was at Harvard University. He graduated, he was in there in 1895. So all these people you see up here, they were not just people, as they say, that fell off the turnip truck. They were educated, highly educated, and they realized that what was going on in this country, it was not living up to the Declaration of Independence. Now, we got White and Marshall. I'm sure everybody knows who they are, right? Okay, on your left is Walter White. No, he's not the one that's on the TV that's making drugs. Walter White was an American civil rights activist, and he led the NAACP as one of their attorneys from 1929 to 55. Then on his left, your right, is Thurgood Marshall. Need I say anything about him? Thurgood Marshall was a Supreme Court justice, and he was replaced, I won't call a name, and I'll just go on. Okay. Friendship Missionary Baptist Church. This is where the first meetings of the Southport NAACP was started here. Now, I'm going to read a little bit of their history. It says, The Untold Story. In a conversation with Miss Ludelphia Rogers, she recounted the formation of Southport NAACP. As we call, a gentleman came to my house in 1963 and introduced himself as having worked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, also, how many people knew that Dr. Martin Luther King was in the NAACP? What was Dr. Martin Luther King in? It was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. Okay, let me get back to my story. Where it says, and he was told to come to us because my husband, Charles, was president of the International Longshoremen's Association and known throughout the county, to the community and county. He asked us to form a chapel of the NAACP in Southport. I attended a workshop in Durham to learn how to go about doing this. I brought back all the information and sent notices to the churches and asked them to meet. We met and the information was given to those in attendance, and Mr. Horton was elected and I served as the secretary. I'm going to flip pictures for here in a minute and then I'll flip back. Friendship was where, Ludelphia and Charles Rogers. This is a picture of Charles. Ludelphia is on the other side. We call her Nunny. She was a cousin of mine. They were the ones in this letter, on the story about the history of the Southport NAACP, were the ones that we looked at being the ones that started it. But now let me clarify this. We have 5 black churches in Southport. And when the NAACP was formed, they took all 5 of these churches together. And that's how they formed it. The only reason I have Friendship is because Nunny went to Friendship. All right. Now, we're going to look at August the 15th, 1963 through November 1963. These are the officers. These were the first officers. Now, they were not the longest serving officers, but they were the first. And who I have here is the president, Clyde Horton. Vice President, Alan Clemens. Second Vice President, Orabelle Clemens. That was his wife. Executive Secretary, Ludelphia Rogers. General Secretary, Marjorie Clemens. Assistant Secretary, Flossie Parker. Treasurer, Van Bellamy. Chaplain, Eugene W. Gore. Sergeant at Arms, George Clarity. Parliamentarian, Nelson Adams Sr., Youth Advisor, Charles Rogers. Now, you notice you see next to a couple of the names here, it says deceased. This was taken out of a program that they had back in, I believe it was 1989. And that's why you see deceased. When you look at this list, everyone on that list is now deceased. And the significance of 1963, what happened in 1963? The Civil Rights March on Washington. It happened there. So what was happening is they were trying to mobilize as many peoples and communities as they could to march onto our nation's capital. And at the time, that was who they had as officers. Now, these officers changed, and you'll see in a few minutes. Now, go to this slide here. This is a slide of Eugene W. Gore. He was the longest serving president of the NAACP here in Southport at the time. He was not the last, by no means, but he was one of the longest. Now, let me get back to the history. History is a record of past events, the economic, social, political, industrial, and religious success and failures of mankind. The local chapter of the NAACP, no less so than the national organization, has had to origin from a humble beginning. The NAACP is a fearless organization that will continue to stand and fight racial inequalities and the unjust has been afflicted upon all mankind. Now, as I said, Mr. Gore was the longest serving. Now, we still have members that were part of the NAACP in those critical years when we were fighting for equal rights that are still living. And one is in here, 2 is in here right now. I won't mention their names right now, but a little later because they're in there. All right, let me go over here. Now, this is Howard Lee Jr. He is standing in front of the old jail. That picture was taken on an interview with Howard. He's now deceased because the Amuse You Theater, they were picketing the Amuse You Theater. And he was one of the ones that was arrested. Later on, he became a deputy in the police department under his cousin, George McCracken, who was the very first black chief of police in Southport and I believe North Carolina. and Howard has since passed on. He was in also, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he was in the March on Washington. You see a lot of things that I'll show you today, and it's sort of like they're connected, and then again, in a standpoint from doing a presentation, they seem not to be connected. But this is all connected because it'll all fit together in a little while. Now, everybody wonders, well, we know that's not Nelson Adams. That is Ed Oliver. And what the story behind this is after Nelson got back from the March on Washington, because they told them all to go home and do something to better their community. Nelson was, I think, about 17 or 18 years old at the March on Washington. There were young people there. And his mother worked for Ed Oliver. And when he came back, he told his mother, if Ed won't let us come in and sit down and eat one of his delicious hamburgers, we always have to go to the back or take it in a bag to go. You should take yourself and leave Ed's house. And so she did. Well, as you see on that sign there, it says, Oliver's Grill. Here lies Oliver's Grill. And you see the part where it said, held his virginity. Now, you can take that several ways, the way that was written. But he retired the store. And when Nelson's mother went back to work for him, she informed him that she would no longer be able to work there. If her son couldn't go into his restaurant and eat, she could no longer work for him. Now, his wife was very distraught about that. In fact, you can go online. There's a story about that in there, and you can Google it. But she was not very happy that she was leaving, but there was no choice in the matter, because Southport is, even though as friendly a little town as it is, there were pockets of segregation right here in Southport. The movies, we couldn't go to the movie. Well, you go to the movie, but you had to go upstairs. And usually they let the whites downstairs, they let them in, and then a little later they come open the side door where we would go up to the top to watch the movies. And so they fought for that. In fact, during that protest of the Amuse You, this young lady named Mary Miller had a tear gas canister explode in her face. And that was something that the city of Southport was hoping would always be forgotten. Now, today's lecture, and Bob asked me to do this, it's not going to be something to where everything is like kumbaya. There were a lot of things that happened here and a lot of small towns that people would soon like to forget, because we should learn from every mistake that we make. Now, I'm going to switch to another picture because I've got something coming up. This is Reverend Walter Welch. Now, when he came here, he was with Trinity. Now, anybody in Trinity, if I got it wrong, let me know. He was a minister at Trinity, but he was also with the NAACP in New York. And so when he came here, he joined the NAACP here. Now, what I'm about to show you now is the roster from 1989, and then I'll get back to the other part of the story. It'll make more sense to you. Okay, here we go. This is Southport NAACP officers circa 1989. Now, it says President Leslie Meyer. It says First Vice President Eugene Gore. Now, remember, between the period of 63 and 89 that I didn't capture, he was in as president. Then you had second vice president was Regina White Alexander. She was the second vice president. Now, Regina had been in an NAACP all her life. I think right after she was born, her mother gave her an NAACP card, and that was it, because she had been with them many years. Now, this is 89. Now remember, this is 2024. She was an officer with the NAACP in 1989. She was also with a youth organization. Like I said, I think she cut her baby teeth on the NAACP. Next, there is Mr. George Courtney. He was the third vice president. Then there was Miss Laura McCracken Smith. And that's Regina's aunt. She was the secretary. The assistant secretary was Gloria Smith Jones. She was the assistant secretary. The treasurer was H.O. Gore. That stands for Harry Ori Gore. I know that name very well because he was my bricklaying instructor and my ninth grade math teacher. And he made sure that you knew what the initials was, and it didn't stand for Hog. It stood for Harry Ori Gore. Okay, then the chaplain was Reverend Walter Welch. That's where the picture came in there. The executive board members, John McMillan. Now, one of the things about the early, and reason I said friendship, Mr. John D. McMillan, his wife Lillian, and all of they were members of the NAACP, and they were very active. They were in the trenches when the young people were getting arrested and put in jail, and they had to have somebody come down there and get them out. And then you had, it says at large, Walter Welch, and it had Gloria Smith Jones as a youth advisor. They'd always had a NAACP youth group as well as the regular group. I don't know whether you knew that or not, but they've always had that when it was in Southport. Before I go in, did anybody have a question? Because I see a look. Okay, all right. Now, let's get back to the story. In the 1960s, there were a lot of racial unrest in the community, and the citizens wanted to alleviate this by obtaining equal justice for all. That goes right back to the one we hold these truths as self-evident. Okay. The local chapter of the NAACP was born out of this racial discord. As a result of the prejudice and injustices, our young people got very involved and established themselves as the youth council under the leadership of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rogers. They let their feelings be known about the many injustices that were being inflicted and the dual system of justice, the denial of jobs, opportunities, segregation, and discrimination in public facilities. Dr. Herbert Eaton and attorney Lisbon Berry also gave advice and assistance during this time. Now, for those who don't know Dr. Herbert Eaton, he was a doctor in Wilmington. And you begin to get the picture about the NAACP and how it sort of just encapsulated all in one. Everybody was linked together. Whether you lived in Southport, whether you lived in Bolivia, whether you live in Charlotte or Wilmington, they're all linked together. Because I was told that when they took the bus to Washington, D.C. in 1963, some of the buses, they came out of Wilmington, they filled them up. In other words, if there wasn't enough members to go from, say, Charlotte, they said, okay, we got these from Southport. They had coordinators. All right, this is the bus you get on. And that's when they made the trip. Now, there was a story that Nelson Adams told me about when they went on the trip for the March on Washington. On the way back, they got stopped in Clinton. And they held them in Clinton for a long time, and they had to get them out. This is some of the dangers in the early years of being in the NAACP and in the civil rights movement. They didn't care if you were 6 years old, because you can see the pictures down in Alabama when I think Bull Connors turned the dogs and the hoses on little kids. That didn't matter. The deal was, in the words of the late George Wallace, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That was their thinking. They felt that blacks were second-class citizens because the majority came over on ships, But over the years, over here, with intermixing of the races, the one thing they always objected to, most of us don't have all pure African blood in us now. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people were surprised to find out that Strom Thurmond had a biracial daughter when he died. It was a secret he well kept, but he made his money and all that off of preaching segregation. You see, if you don't have education and you don't have an idea of what's going on, I can tell you anything. If that window is down, I'd say, you know what, it's raining like cats and dogs out of here. I would not go outside. Now, if you believe me, guess what? You won't go outside. But there'll always be one say, wait a minute, it ain't raining out there. And that's basically how the South kept everybody at bay. Because when you think about it, who were the cooks? They were black. Who took care of the children? They were blacks. Who cleaned your house? They were blacks. And so you're going to make them second-class citizens. And I always wondered as a little kid, well, why do I have to go through the back door? Even at the doctor's office, they had white and colored. This was something that the NAACP, ever since 1909, was fighting against. Now, the NAACP started here in 1963. A little later, I'll show you some other organizations that was here in this area fighting for civil rights, but they wasn't called the NAACP. So let me get back to here. The Southport Brunswick County NAACP was formally organized and chartered August the 15th, 1963. The citizens of Southport, including the youth, showed their feelings through demonstrations and marches and began an immediate drive to seek redress of some of the social, economic, and political problems facing blacks. The Youth Council, in its endeavor to break down some of these many racial barriers to first-class citizenship, during the same time our youth were demonstrating and protesting peacefully the brutal actions of the chief of police of Southport against the youth. The Southport NAACP, from its origin, recognized and utilized the vision, energy, wholesome militance of the youth. Hence, as was true on all national levels. Now, the chief of police at that time, I believe, was Chief Willis. And he was the one that he arrested, I believe it was Howard Lee, William Thomas. Now, if y'all don't know this name, don't worry about that. I'll explain them to you later. And they carried him down to jail. Now, these young teenagers are put in there with all the other criminals that was in there. Because the deal of it was, if we can break this, if we can stop this before it gets out of hand, we won't have to worry about it, and they'll all be just like we want them. But I never could figure how in the world, in my way of thinking, if I'm cooking your food, I'm washing your clothes, and all of that, and you consider me a second-class citizen, and you sit down at the dinner table to this beautiful meal that I cooked, you don't know what I put in there. I think the movie was The Help. Did anybody see that?
Oh, yeah.
After I saw that movie, I will not eat chocolate pie. Never again. No. No. And there were some, I always wondered about some of the restaurants. If you treat people like they're second-class citizens and animals, and then you have them feeding you and all that, I don't know. That's just not me. Now, let me go ahead here because I don't want to run out of time. This was the program. It was the Brunswick County NAACP banquet award ceremony. This was in 1989. 89. It was held at the ILA Hall. And the speaker was none other than Kelly Alexander Jr. Now, Southport was a small little town, but they reached national prominence because they've had speakers from the NAACP from all over come here. And let me see, I'm going to flip to the next page. Next slide. I forgot, Musette, you're not doing this. So, and over here, it had the program itself, who the speakers were, and they had memorial tribute by Deacon, wait a minute, see if I can see it on here, because mine is smaller. That's why I wrote most of it out, except for that. So excuse me 1 second. I get over here where I can see it. Hubert Reeves. Now, Hubert Reeves, for those who don't know, he's still living. He was a Vietnam veteran, U.S. Marine Corps. He went over and he served his country. And a lot of the people that was in the NAACP and fighting for civil rights, they fought in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And yet when they come home, people look at them funny. It's like, hey, you can't go into this front door here. In fact, if you knew your history, if you're a history buff like myself, World War I, that's why you have so many French-speaking blacks who live in France. Is because when they came back from serving in France, because the U.S. didn't want them to serve in their army, so they gave them to the French. They were persecuted, they were killed and everything else. So a lot of them went back to France. Same way with World War II. Vietnam, same thing. The only difference is this group, they were a little bit more, how should I say, battle tested, and they wasn't going to take no for an answer. So let's get here to someone else that I'm very familiar with. This is Mr. Jesse A. Bryant. The A is for Abel Bryant. He was with the Cedar Grove chapter of the NAACP. Now, I know we're talking about Southport, but what happened was they all formed out of that, because before that, Mr. Bryant and some of the members out in the other part of the county, they had other organizations. It wasn't the NAACP, but when they formed a chapter in Southport, they basically came along and started one out in Cedar Grove. But Southport was the very first in 1963. And Mr. Bryant was known as Mr. NAACP. He served many years. I think it was close to 40 in the NAACP. Now, he and Mr. Eugene Gore, they aligned on a lot of things, especially on marches in North Carolina, all over North Carolina, and when they had the national marches. Now, this group here, I call the Rural Rights Riders. Who you see there on the left side, from your left, is Mr. Jesse Bryant. The gentleman next to him is Mr. George Courtney. Now, Mr. Courtney, if you notice that you saw that he was with the Southport NAACP. Next is Mr. Willie Gardner. And then after Mr. Willie Gardner, we have Mr. Frank Randolph. These men were relentless in getting the rights for everyone obtained. And like I said, they worked with Southport. They worked with anybody that would work with them. And they were all mostly wound up being underneath the Cedar Grove chapter of the NAACP. So for a while, there were actually two chapters that originated out of the Southport chapter. It's sort of like Southport, then they had Cedar Grove chapter, and after that, I forget the exact year, we had a merger. What you see there, Mr. Jesse Bryant in the middle, Mr. Eugene Gore on your right side, and that is Bernice Hewitt on the left. Some call him LaRue Hewitt. They merged the two to make it just one NAACP. And Bernice was the one that was in charge of that. Now, the reason you see those two gentlemen there with him is because Bernice is about a year older than me. And they were giving him the lowdown. In other words, they were giving him the 411 on what to do and everything, because everybody thought after the signing of the in 1964 of the Civil Rights Bill, everything was over with, but it wasn't. It was just starting, because that's not the first Civil Rights Bill that the U.S. government had signed. The U.S. government signed civil rights bills like what the Indians used to say about the U.S. government signing treaties. They sign a treaty on Monday and break it on Tuesday if it didn't fit their needs. So there was a need for the NAACP to continue. Now, Mr. Bryant and Mr. Gore knew at that time that they were getting up there in age, because if you saw back earlier, Leslie Myers in '89 took over the NAACP helm, because he was the president. This is Bernice LaRue Hewitt. I would say he was a cousin of mine, but if I do that, everybody think I'm kin to everybody. So I won't say that he is a cousin of mine. That was Bernice. Now, he served for many years at NAACP, and then he moved the reins over to Carl Parker, who is now the NAACP president. But I want to say this, and I'm going to finish reading this after we get through it. Everybody's names in there, and that's Carl Parker. He's the one we have now. And to finish what I started here we're going down here. This chapter was instrumental in assisting towards the integration of the Brunswick County school system, getting blacks admitted to hospital rooms in the upstairs of Dozier Hospital. Did always with two textbooks. It says did away with two textbooks, one for the blacks and one for the whites. Did you know that? They had two textbooks. One was for the blacks and one was for the whites. So then I wonder what was on those textbooks. Was mine, well, at that time I wasn't old enough, was my taxes higher than yours? Or was yours higher than mine? This is some of the work they did. There were two Bibles in the courthouse, one for blacks and one for whites. In other words, most of the time there were blacks cleaning the courthouse, and they still had two Bibles, because I guess some people at that time, because of segregation, didn't want to touch something that a black had touched. Little would they know that the person who cleaned up the courthouse was black. So they might have went over there on the white Bible and did like this, just rubbed all over both sides and all the pages. It shows you the ignorance that was rampant in our society at that time. Okay. Assisted blacks in getting jobs in local governments, the tax office, clerk of court, banking institutions, stores, and many, many more. Another function of this chapter was the election of the blacks to public office. Mr. James Harold Davis became the first black to serve on the Southport City Council. Willie Sloan, first black elected county commissioner. Erla Mae Parker, first black employed in the clerk of court's office. Tillman Bowen was the first black to serve on the Brunswick County Board of Education. Regina White Alexander was the first black clerk to the Board of County Commissioners. Mildred Cox, the first black in the tax office. Rebecca Smith, the first black tax lister, just to name a few. Though concerns efforts of the branch, Southport had the first black chief of police in the state of North Carolina in the person of George R. McCracken. These are just a few of the many breakthroughs that were made. Sheriff Ed Leonard and Eugene Gore, then president of the chapter, removed last sign posted at the courthouse that read, "Blacks only, whites only." Since the year of 1963, the NAACP has had 5 presidents. We're talking about the Southport. It was Mr. Clyde Horton, Eugene Gore, Reverend Winston Brown, George Courtney, and Leslie Meyer. The local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People stands ready to continue its effort to promote equality and justice in the areas of armed services and veterans affairs, education, housing, labor and industry, political action, religious affairs, and youth work. Our history is much more in depth than this synopsis, but we have attempted to give you the origin of the chapter. We have learned a very important lesson. Together we stand, divided we fall. Where there is unity, there is strength. All that this chapter has accomplished has been through sheer dedication, determination, love for our fellow man, and kindred hearts for each other. There is still work to be done. We all working together should realize the truthfulness of this statement. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I read about eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Southport NAACP. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story behind the story of the Southport NAACP. In the words of my late history teacher, Mr. Ralph Parker, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask Ms. Regina White Alexander just to wave her hand up. I mean, I know you don't have to say anything because I don't want you to kill me later. But Regina, she has been on the front line. Like I said, she was on there as a little kid. I don't know how, Regina, how old were you when you first got involved with the NAACP? You don't have to tell us how old you are now.
I was a little girl. And Eugene Gore is the one that bought my first membership. He asked my mother.
Uh-huh.
And he used to carry me by my hand, and I would follow him. And that's how I got involved.
Yeah.
My mother gave him permission to take care of me.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember being on the bus traveling, and I was young, probably. I was probably around maybe 5th grade, somewhere like that, 4th grade. Mm-hmm.
Regina and her family have been outstanding citizens here in the city of Southport. And I can't also go without saying Brown's Chapel, because, see, one of the 5 churches is Brown's Chapel. And the White family and McCracken family, all the family is on Jabbertown Road. Brown's Chapel has been part of them. Now, we have someone else in here that at that time she was Mother of the Year. I think it was in '89 when I had that slide up there about the NAACP banquet. I think that's Emma Joyner Miles. Emma, can you raise your hand? And she was at the library for a while. You know, it's amazing. I left here in, I think it was 1972. I was just going on a short vacation, and it lasted till 2002. I was single when I left, and I came back. I was married, and I had a grown daughter. But also, right beside Regina is her brother, James White, and he's with the United States Color Troop. And he's a reenactor. And for all of those who go over there in Wilmington, I'm not telling you to do that, at the Cameron Art Museum, when you look at that statue, he's on the statue. He posed for it. Because quite naturally, when that statue was done, there were no one from the Civil War that was still alive. If there were, they couldn't stood up long enough or sat down long enough to have posed for that. His brother Joseph White also is on that statue. James does a lot of work around here, and he does it in areas. They're in Raleigh, and every year at the Black History Symposium, he's right there. And so James is like one of my right-hand men and fellow Jabbertonians. So whenever you hear that term, it's not Jabbertownian, it's Jabbertonians. Let's make sure we get it straight. I thank all of you. There is so much that's with the NAACP, so much that you can't cover it in an hour. So I just brushed across it and highlighted it as best I could, because truly that was a monumental time. I can remember when Mae Miller had that tear gas canister explode in her face. I remember some of the marches. My father, he was with the NAACP, Cedar Grove branch. He wouldn't let me out on a lot of these. In fact, on March on Washington, I was watching it on TV. Did you have a question?
I do, Donnie. First of all, thank you so much, because that was really enlightening to hear about how the NAACP chapter here got started. Now, that was many, many years ago. How would you characterize the goals, the objectives of the NAACP in '63 compared to 2024?
I think they're basically the same, because I know this is 2024, but when you look around, we have some of the same problems. The only difference is they're disguised differently. You see now, I'll use a term. How many of you here know what the word woke means?
Yeah.
Okay. You know what it means. What was your definition?
Well, that means that you're awakened to all this new thinking and sort of thing. You're not going to go along with the old ways anymore.
Okay.
You got it all together.
Okay. Anybody else want to hit us on what woke is?
Woke, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I ain't either. It's not even 12 o'clock yet. Well, when I heard the term woke, the first thing popped in my mind is that there were a lot of people in this country that realized, hey, wait a minute. These blacks have figured it out. They figured out what's going on. So now they're woke. So when you hear them say the woke agenda, I remember one young lady who was on TV, and they asked her, well, can you explain woke? She said, well, woke is, and she couldn't explain it. That was a term that we used to use, you're woke. Yeah, that means that you were paying attention and you were listening. And that's what creates all of this now, is the fact that the young people in the black communities, they have awakened to what their parents and grandparents were trying to tell them here. And so that has put some people on blast. I won't call any names, but there are a lot of people that use that term woke. There was an old saying, and forgive me for saying this, there used to be a saying, how do you keep a secret from a black man? What's the answer? Put it in a book. That meant that none of us read, which is not true. A lot of them read. When you look at the colleges, now what they've said is, okay, we've had everybody's on equal playing field now, so we need to get rid of affirmative action. And so we're going to get rid of this, we're going to get rid of that, and we're back to the same place, because some of the people that tell you we need to fight against the woke agenda, meaning is they want to move the clock back to not 1963, not 53, not 43, all the way back to 1903. At that time, women didn't have the right to vote. Now, when you look in this country, I know most of the time it's a male president and all that, but the women in this country, if they want to, if they unite themselves together, now I'm not preaching now, so don't give no amens, all right? If they unite themselves together, they can do anything in this country that they want. Because most of the time, some of the women are afraid to vote because their husband says, you better not vote for this person, you better vote for that. I know that for a fact. When I was at Home Depot, I had a good friend of mine, he said, well, I tell my wife who to vote for. And I said, well, I may tell my wife, but she ain't gonna listen. When she goes in that booth, when you go into that voting booth, when you're behind there, there's nobody in there but you and God. You know right from wrong, and you know how to vote. And that's what we got to get away from. And for years, I remember we had a while back about women's suffrage, Miss Annie Clemens. Women in I think it was about 1920, and I'm not going to call any names, but there's one guy running for governor, I'm not going to call any names, that he said that we were better off if we're back in the 1910s and all that. Now, I see him and I don't see him. And if we, and when I say we, all of us, if we don't keep our minds open and for change, God help us, because you got Russia, you got China, and what's the first thing you do? It's called divided. No, I'm sorry. Together we stand, divided we fall. And when anybody can divide us, if we let anybody divide us, our country will fall. We will not know what hit us. And in North Carolina, and this is not a political speech, I hope when everybody goes vote, I can't tell you who to vote for governor. I hope you make the right decision, because if not, you might not get a chance to vote again. You only need once, and then somebody else will be voting for you. I thank you. Any other questions, by the way? Yes, sir.
So you talked about the 5 churches that were active in the original formation of the NAACP.
Yes.
And I assume they were all predominantly black.
Yes.
Was there any outreach or connection with some of the white churches at the same time, or was it really a standalone?
No, they wasn't really standalone, because Walter Welch, he was the pastor at Trinity.
At Trinity.
Now,
but did he bring his congregation with him?
No, I don't know. Regina might be able to answer that for you.
The Southport NAACP Church Fellowship was formed out of all the churches.
White and black.
White and black. Mm-hmm. And that was as a result of the NAACP. We came together. And so, as a matter of fact, our church is hosting a church fellowship for September. But we're very active in the community. We're very active. And the church is coming together. And I don't like to say black church or white church, because we're all God's children. It just happened during those times we were separated. And another thing, and Donnie is very good with history, and we grew up together, although he's a few years old.
Yeah. Oof.
Southport was a very unique place. Yes, we had some issues, but we grew up together. Although we went to our homes, because our former mayor, Norman Holder, told me he used to play basketball with Peter Banks and all that group. And I grew up, if Tom Floyd and Geneva had, we had, because my dad used to shrink, they had. So we were separated, but in lots of ways we weren't. It was just certain pockets that had their issues. And I think you alluded to that when you were talking about it. Certain pockets of the area, so very unique. But yes, the churches do work together. Trinity, they're active.
Amen.
St. Philip's, Oak Island, Presbyterian, the Methodist Church, we all work together, the Episcopal churches in the Southport, Oak Island Church Fellowship.
When did the schools integrate in Brunswick County?
73 was the first year they had the consolidated school built, but in 1970, Southport and Brunswick County High School merged. And I believe it was 69. It was Union and Shellout, and Union became a middle school. And Lincoln merged with Leland, and Lincoln became a middle school. But the last school, black school, that closed down as a high school was Brunswick County High School. It used to be called Brunswick County Training. And to piggyback on what Regina said, the Interchurch Fellowship, and especially Trinity when it comes to Mount Carmel, because when we had that steeple come down, we had people from all in this community, all churches, whether they were black churches or white churches. Some were offering their services. You can use our building. We have services such time you can use the building. And then they went in their pockets. They went in their pockets before our conference could go into their pocket. So we always have a kinship with them. And Trinity, we always have a kinship with Trinity, because the building that we have church in was the old Methodist South building, which is what you call Trinity now. And one other thing, I found this out the other day, it was used as a hospital during the Civil War. Used as a hospital. Yes, and school. And Musette is my good friend, so if you say anything about me, make sure, and so is Pat, so make sure that the ones up on these front 2 rows, don't tell them because they'll probably tell me. Anyway, I really appreciate all y'all being here. I know we're running out of time because Bob's got the hook. You can always contact with me, and I'll be glad any way I can. But thank you, and thank you for allowing us to share the story of Southport's NAACP. Now, I don't believe in advertisement, but there's a couple of NAACP membership here if you would like. I think, well, let me see. It's $30. I wanted to make sure it's right so they call and charge me too much money when I join. Okay. It's $30 for an adult. And annual, that's for corporations. And they have I think it's a lifetime membership. I believe it's like 50, how much is it? 75 a year. 75 a year for lifetime membership? Okay, and I'll see some others. Well, I have a few of them here if anybody would like one. And if you make out the check, make sure you make it out to the right name. And please don't make it out to Donnie Joyner, because as soon as my wife sees a check in my bag that has my name on it, she wants to cash it. Thank you so much.